I think a lot of readers whose native language isn't English are going to relate to this. Greetings, my name is Nina, welcome back to my channel, and in this video I want to discuss a topic that is pretty relevant to me, something I think a lot about, and the topic is languages. Here is a bit of my background. I was born in Russia, in Moscow, and I grew up there. And throughout my childhood, I spent a lot of time between Moscow and Tbilisi. So yeah, I grew up between Russia and Georgia, switching back and forth. So since I grew up in Russia, my first language is Russian. Then I learned Georgian naturally at home because it was the language that was spoken at home. And when I was 5 years old, I started learning English. And I'd say that I'm learning to this day. I'd say that before 2020, I did not read in English massively. Okay, I did read in English. I have a collection of Penguin Readers adapted books. I think you've heard of these short Penguin Readers books made for English learners. And I started buying them in 2007. However, at the time, one thing that I did not care about was the levels. So yeah, in English language you have these levels like upper intermediate, advanced, blah 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 blah. I did not care about that at all because I looked at the stories. I picked up the books that were interesting to me, and also some of the books were adaptations of some of the films that I liked. For example, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, I still have that one. Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, Jumanji. Actually, I watched Jumanji after I read it. And also the first two Mummy movies. Okay, my English level was a bit lower when I started buying these books, but I did not care about levels, like I said. Speaking of Penguin Readers, I made a TikTok comparing the first page of Stephen King's Misery, the adapted version, Penguin Readers, to original novel written by Stephen King. The very first page of both are so different. And to this day, this is the most successful YouTube shorts that I have uploaded. I think it has 30,000 views or something. I did not read in English massively, I mean the full novels, until 2020. Okay, technically, I first read Diary of a Wimpy Kid by Jeff Kinney, but this book is basically half a comic. I mean, just look at it. Well, it was quite an easy to read, and if you're learning English, it's an easy read. Although I always thought that this book was kinda mean. Well, yeah, it was mean-spirited. Even back then, I sensed that. But despite this, every time I talk about this book, I always like this quote that is featured on the back. I'll be famous one day, but for now I'm stuck in middle school with a bunch of morons. Yeah, there were a bit of toxic moments in this book, but it was still fun to read to some extent. I know that it was made into a movie, but I never watched it. The very first full novel in English that I read was in 2019. It was Will Grayson by John Green and David Levithan. Correct me how to pronounce his last name. Sure, John Green novels are pretty light to read, but I felt that one was way too difficult for me to read. I struggled reading it, despite the fact that it was a relatively easy book to read now when I think about it. That was in 2019. Yeah, that was the first full English novel that I read that wasn't an adaptation, that wasn't a short story, that wasn't a required read or whatever. This was the first book that I read. But yeah, in general, I did not start reading in English properly until 2020. And then 2020 came and things started to change. So in January 2020, I decided that rereading The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien for the second time was a good idea, so I decided to go for it. Even though that book was relatively easier to read on the second read compared to the first one, I still struggled through it. Well, the Silmarillion is difficult to read even in Russian. I just can't imagine how it sounds in English. But despite this, I came across a story that caught my eye. It was the chapter, I think it was chapter 19, I do not remember. It was a chapter dedicated to Bern and Luthien. And after I read the book, I discovered that there was a shop in my area that had that book, and it was in English. Yes, I found this book in a shop, and it was quite expensive, I think. It was 47 lari. I looked at it. I really liked the illustrations. Alan Lee did an amazing job working on this one. And then I realized I'm going to get through it. I'm going to read it. And so I bought this book, and I'm glad I did it when I did, because right after I bought this book, everything closed down. Yes, this was the last book that I bought before the shutdown, and yeah, I'm glad I picked it up on time. I did tell myself I'm going to go through this, and the most surprising part is that I did. I read this book. It took me 3 months to read it, but I managed to do so. Okay, when I started reading it, I did originally use a dictionary because there were a lot of words that I did not know. But then I was like, to hell with it, I'm going to go through it. And if there are words I do not know, I'm going to understand them in a context. And that's kind of what happened, because 3 words that I learned from this book are malice, thrall, and befall. Okay, do not get me wrong, I did not abandon a dictionary altogether. However, I decided to stop using it for every word that I did not know. Yeah, they raised me to believe that I need a dictionary to understand every word, la 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 la, and I think that's not exactly necessary, because the understanding of the context is much more important than simply translating, because when you know the context, you will learn the word naturally instead of memorizing it. I read this, and then I thought to myself, if I read the Tolkien in English, I can handle anything. Spoiler alert, I was wrong. Okay, not exactly, because after I read Bern and Luthien, I did have confidence to continue reading in English. However, I wasn't able to read anything I want in the language. Yeah, that was the point. I really wanted to read a book, and I only could read an English version. I went for it. And so the next book that I really wanted to read after Bern and Luthien was The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Now here's where I want to make a confession, and you would probably think that I wasn't entirely pressured to read in English, but still. I originally started reading The Name of the Wind in Russian online. And you would probably think, oh Nina, you had the option, you could have read in Russian, but you still decided to buy an English version. Yada yada yada. Well, technically that's true, however, here's the kicker. I'm not entirely into reading e-format, and then I noticed when I was reading online, I lost my concentration skills. I barely concentrated, and I felt something was off, and my mind kept switching to other books, the physical copies. Yes, the online book format did not keep my eye on The Name of the Wind. So I started reading it, I think in June 2020, then abandoned, and then I found out that the same shop that had Bern and Luthien also had The Name of the Wind in English. By the time I did not find the Russian version, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to go for it. And so I did. The Name of the Wind is very beautifully written. Yeah, there are things that I want to say about the series. No, it's not the fact that the Doors of Stone aren't released. There are things to discuss about the series that I clearly did not like, but it's still a favorite of mine. I still love it. And I do not regret originally reading it in English. Yeah, in 2023 I got the Russian version too. Not because I struggled through with it, but because I liked the series so much, I decided to reread it in Russian. Just because I could. And also because the editions were beautiful too. This book took a few months to read. And between Burning Luthien and The Name of the Wind, I also read His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. Yeah, this book is around 1,000 pages long, and I needed a few months to read it. Yeah, I was very determined to read in English back in 2020. I originally did have a chance to buy the Russian version at least of the first book, but it was sold out, so I went for this copy. Yeah, technically I could read them in Russian online, but I really wanted a physical copy, and I decided that I could improve English and I could read anything after Tolkien, like I said. And now, since I'm talking about His Dark Materials, yeah, I wanna complain a little. I can't say that I liked the series that much. I'm going to say this. The third one sucked hard. It made it to my worst books video. Yeah, I hated the third one to the point that I even for a brief moment considered ripping it out of the book. And in overall, I'm not a huge fan of His Dark Materials, not simply because of the third book, but mostly because I thought that the characters and plot points were too mechanical, and that the characters, they did things because they were programmed to do, and in general the books, they lacked souls. Well, yeah, this is a very ironic statement given that characters in this book, they have souls outside their bodies in a form of animal named demons. Not demons, daemons. Maybe the series, they have a daemon outside somewhere because I did not find it in the book. But nonetheless, the first two books were relatively good. Yeah, I do feel like His Dark Materials, they feel programmed, they feel very soul lacking, dry, and they lack kinda emotional depth. However, I have good memories of the time that I bought and started reading this book, and also this is a very beautiful Everyman's Library edition. It's a British one, because in the American version, the first book, Northern Lights, is called The Golden Compass, and that's the name of the film based on the first book. You know what, as a foreign English reader, I do find it a bit odd that some books, for example, His Dark Materials and Harry Potter, they were adapted specifically for American audience. But that's a topic for another video, so let's move on. But yeah, I'm going to keep this book due to the nostalgia and also the fact that it's a beautiful book, and also I'm considering to reread it. But to the author's credit, this book, it did not seem difficult for me as a foreign English reader. Yeah, I did not struggle that much while reading this. And so I slowly started growing my collection of books in English. In 2021 it went mildly. So I counted books bought in 2021, and only 11 out of nearly 50 were in English, so that was okay result for me. And then came 2022. That was the year where everything absolutely changed. Okay, I'm not going to go through a lot of details. Let me say that my access to books in Russian got limited. At that time, I also followed the concept of finding books in bookstores, and nearly all books that I liked in bookstores that I was willing to read, for example, A History of Heavy Metal by Andrew O'Neill, they were in English. And in 2022, for the first time ever, the amount of books bought and read in English preceded the amount of books bought and read in Russian. Yeah, I bought more books in English than in Russian, which was very surprising for me. But you know what, I really wanted to read the book, and even though I struggled, I still wanted to do that, and so I went for it. This trend continued in 2023, and I consider that year to be the odd year because even in English I couldn't find most books that were too very interesting to me. No, I did find them, but not enough. A lot of books were experimental, and I donated them. Well, one of those books was The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. One of the reasons that it fell off for me. One of the reasons I gave it 3 stars was my struggle to read in English. I had a Masterworks edition of that book, and for some reason, Masterworks edition, they have very tiny font, and I did not like it. The language does play its part when it comes to reading books. Maybe I did not like some of them because I read them in the wrong language. And also, I do consider to this day my biggest book failure ever the Neuromancer trilogy by William Gibson. Had I bought only the first book, that would have been fine. But I bought 3 of them. I wasted a lot of money on that one, and I did not even finish the first one. Backed off when I read the first third of the book. I just couldn't handle it anymore. I think I bought all 3 of them at once because I liked the editions. They were very beautiful. That was a total failure on my part. I shouldn't have bought 3 of the books without reading the first one. The buying the series before reading the first one is not a problem for me per se. So The Witcher, Dune, Wheel of Time, and some other series I bought before reading the first one. However, none of these series belonged to a genre that was too experimental and in English. All were in Russian, and there was a high probability that I would like them, and that's what happened. This is why I do not regret buying the series before reading the first one. Neuromancer, on the other hand, was an experimental genre, and in English. Now when I think about it, maybe if I give this book another chance in Russian, maybe I would actually like it. But not right now. I'm not interested in such genre right now. But maybe. Please do not buy experimental books in series in English if it's not your native language. It's way too risky. Or at least get the first one only. Oh yeah, the trend of reading books in English slowly started softening in 2024, and then came 2025. So there is this marketplace called Wildberries, and last autumn or winter, yes, in late 2024 it opened in Georgia. When I discovered Wildberries, I saw that it had a lot of books that I actually wanted to read. And not experimental books, and I was like, I need them. So I'm filming this in October 2025, and for the last 2 months I have been obsessed with ordering books on Wildberries. All of them were in Russian and only one was in English. Okay, in overall, I do not regret reading in English because I benefited a lot from it, and it did improve my English level. And I also managed to write my own novel in English somehow. And also I wrote the book before I started reading in English massively, and I started reading massively in 2022. I do like reading in English. Moreover, I had the chance to get The Secret History by Donna Tartt in Russian. I had the choice, and I still went for the English version because I wanted to. I could. Okay, I need to be honest. I went for the English version predominantly because I like the cover. The English version is very beautiful. I like this edition a lot. And also, I originally read Bunny by Mona Awad in English. Yes, it was a library book. It was kind of difficult, and I had a limited time. I had around a week to read it. And you know what? I wanted to get the English version, not the Russian one. And I'm considering buying the English version because I liked it. Obviously, I'm keeping this one, but I want also the English version. However, reading in English wasn't always easy, and it wasn't just about the fact that the books were difficult or they were written in a very odd way. My point is that not all books were worth reading in English. It's not just about the difficulty level, sometimes it's also about the fact that the translation is simply better than the original. Well, for example, while I wouldn't call the original book bad, I still think that the Russian translation of And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie was better than the original. Yeah, it happens that sometimes reading in particular language alters my perception of a book. I do think that language was one of the reasons Neuromancer wasn't my thing, although, to be fair, I think that even in Russian I wouldn't be a fan of it. I doubt that. And as for The Dispossessed, the plot of that book kinda sounds similar to a children's book called Незнайка на Луне. Dana on the Moon, Незнайка. Dano, aka don't know, Dana. And it has the same premise, two planets, one is friendly, the other is profit oriented or something. And the character from the first planet goes to the second. Yeah, I'd rather read Незнайка. And also one more, I'm heavily biased against books in English that were originally translated from other languages. I think it stems from the fact that back in 2017 I bought A Girl in Exile by Ismail Kadare for the sole purpose of improving my English skills, because at the time I started going to university that was in English. I studied in English and I thought, why not read some fiction in English? But then I felt like the novel was way too difficult for me to read. I struggled. It felt odd reading that book, and a few years later I learned that it was translated. The original language is Albanian. Yes, I do have biases, and not necessarily because the English translation might suck. It's because that is unsafe area for me, and if the book is originally written in another language, if the original language isn't English, I'd rather go for the Russian translation, even if done badly. Because in English I'd rather read the books that were written originally in that language. Okay, do not get me wrong, I do not mind non-fiction like Yuval Noah Harari's books or Humankind, A Hopeful History by Rutger Bregman being translated from other languages into English. Non-fiction, as modern non-fiction, is relatively fine. But fiction, on the other hand, even though Sophie's World by Usain Gorder isn't entirely fiction, I'd rather read in Russian. Okay, I do think that Sophie's World is a unique novel because it mixes real-life philosophy with a fictional story. I read around 90 pages. While I liked the book, I found out that the Russian translation exists, and I'd rather read it in Russian because this whole book goes slowly for me. To be fair, in 2025 I do not feel like reading in English. I do not really want to read in English that much anymore. Don't get me wrong, I still do, just not as much as I did in the past. Okay, there's certain struggles of reading in English were always kinda there. Some books I quit because of it. For example, I quit A Fire Upon the Deep by Werner Winch and also Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I always brushed the struggles off. In 2021 I knew I wanted to read Lord of the Rings in English. I did, and it took me 2 years to read them in English. Yes, it felt uneasy, just like going into Mordor for the main characters. But I went for it all the same, even though it took me 2 years. 2 years I needed to read this book. Oh yeah, I managed to go through Lord of the Rings books in English. The Hobbit felt easier, but then again, it's written in a different style. Yeah, I've always brushed the struggles off, and it was only recently when, whilst scrolling through Wildberries, I came through Winter Tales by Hans Christian Andersen. There is no such book in English. This is predominantly a collection in Russian of Hans Christian Andersen's winter fairy tales. Something, The Snow Queen, The Ice Maiden, etc. The Winter Tales. Oh, and also look at this bookmark that I bought right after I received the book, Ariel and the Flounder. So this bookmark does not really fit the aesthetics of this book. However, they were both created by Anderson, so this is why I put the bookmark over here. It was this book that made me realize the full extent of everything, and I finally admitted that circumstances pressured me to read in English. If I wanted to read something, I had to go English, because otherwise I would not have read it at all, even if I've had the online versions. So the winter fairy tales I also have over here, this Macmillan's Collector's Library edition of Hans Christian Andersen's best fairy tales. I read some of them in a vlog in 2022, and it was a struggle, both because the font was very small, it was translated from Danish, it was written centuries ago, it featured a specific language. Yeah, it wasn't easy. But now that I have discovered Wildberries, I feel more free. You see, I've always thought that randomly entering bookstores and finding books was the best method of finding them, not listening to anybody and simply searching and finding random gems. True, of course. However, Wildberries gave me freedom to choose. And it's not just about the language, it was simply about books that I wanted to read. It was about the freedom of picking up books from the list that I wanted to read. Sure, I also have a Kindle now, and some books that I wanted to read are on Kindle. I read them. However, if there is a chance for me to get a physical copy, why not? Okay, here I have my journal from 8th January to 21st June 2025. Yeah, with an Apple sticker in the middle. In this journal, I have a list of books that I want to read. Some of them I already had on my shelves, and there were a lot of books that I wanted to read and own physical copies of. I got Tommy Knockers, and also The Once and Future King, The Arithmetist. Okay, to be fair, there is one book that I'm glad that I read on Kindle instead of getting a physical copy of, and I'm actually glad that I didn't find it. It's a Wolf Song by TJ Klune. The book started out well, however, it felt a lot like a cringe Twilight fanfiction, just without the extra romance. Yeah, the book does kinda make fun of Twilight. The main character is told, "Oh, your life is basically cringe Twilight fanfiction." I did not enjoy that one, and this is one of the rare cases when I'm glad that I do not own the book. And this is what Kindle saves me from. And another book that I was saved from, kinda, was A Songmaster by Orson Scott Card. I hated it so much. Okay, other books that I really want to read but I do not own. The Innkeeper's Song by Peter S. Beagle, and also Floating Dragon by Peter Straub. The Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin. East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Okay, there's also Nick and the Glimung by Philip K. Dick. I'm actually surprised that not a lot of people talk about this book. Sure, Philip K. Dick wrote it for his kids, but it was still a solid story. I never found a physical copy, so I had to go for Kindle, and if there is a chance to buy it, why not? I really want to get the reappearance of Rachel Price by Holly Jackson, and in general I want more of Holly Jackson's books. Fairy Tale by Stephen King. Hearts in Atlantis that I ordered. Magnifico, the A to Z of Queen by Mark Blake. Okay, some of these books, they're not translated into Russian, but I still want to get them. Yeah, after discovering Wildberries, I forgot how to shop for books in actual bookstores, because I keep buying the planned books on Wildberries. Yes, I have the freedom now. I never realized the full extent of the fact that external factors pressured me to go English. I did not realize it. One fun fact about this edition. Out of all winter fairy tales that are written over here, the titles, only one is written in English. The rest are all in Danish. And the tale is The Ice Maiden. Yes, the only fairy tale whose title is written in English for some reason. And so, what comes next? Given that I have freedom to buy books that I want, and that I do not read that much in English anymore. Of course, I'm going to continue reading in English. The books in English aren't going anywhere, they're not ending or something. However, I am setting myself free from the pressure slowly, and I do accept the fact that while I do like reading in English, it started with external pressure. It was subtle, but still. Okay, I did mention that I originally believed that after Tolkien I could handle anything in English, and that wasn't entirely true. Well, here are my limits. I absolutely cannot fathom all the English text. Well, take John Milton, for example. I have his book Areopagitica and Other Writings, the one that has the tenure of kings and the magistrates in English, and I still haven't read it. And also, I know for sure that I absolutely cannot handle. So, I absolutely love the Stormlight Archive books by Brandon Sanderson, but I would not be able to read it in English like I did the Kingkiller Chronicle. These books are way too huge for me and they're full of certain words. So, last year, I was reading Elantris by Sanderson and also A Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. While I originally started reading them in English, I later got a Kindle, downloaded the Russian versions, and I finished them very fast. Yes, the English version would have taken months, if not years, to read. With the Russian version, I handled that in a matter of days. Yes, I absolutely cannot stand all the English texts, and unfortunately the tenure of kings and magistrates I did not find in Russian. Epic fantasy features a lot of odd words, because fantasy writers, they do like to come up with words, because they're fantasy authors. And I struggled so much. And yeah, here are my limits. Old English texts and longer fantasy epics with a lot of made-up words. I couldn't have read Dune or Wheel of Time in English. Alright, that's all. Thank you so much for watching. I finally feel kinda free. See you next time. Goodbye.